Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in and welcome to PSC Archery's Behind the Peep podcast.
Well, now we got to let the 160s walk. Well, that's a hard thing to do. It becomes a mental game. It's not a physical game at that point now. Hopefully when you let them go, Mother Nature's not going to take them in some way.
Or your neighbor.
Or the neighbor.
Yeah. I'm joined today with a special guest, world-renowned and well-known in the whitetail space, Greg Glesinger. Greg, thanks for coming on the podcast and joining me here at the Four Canyons Ranch in Texas.
Thanks for having me, man. What a beautiful setting this is. I mean, it's world class.
It is.
I've seen it on YouTube, read about it, but to be here, it's next level stuff.
Yeah, certainly. A lot of beautiful mounts in this lodge area that we're in here. Some really incredible sheep mounts from all around the world on top of that fireplace, as well as a bunch of really interesting character whitetails and just some awesome trophies.
Yeah, it's hard to put it in words until you're here, but what they do here is a true management at a level that I think we all aspire to do.
Yeah, it's kind of like the crown jewel of, whitetail fantasy, but also that's not really a reality for a lot of people.
Very true.
Yeah. It's kind of something that's reserved for the upper echelon, and sometimes, how big's your deer, how big's your wallet? A lot of places.
Unfortunately, there's truth to that.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
But it takes a lot of dedication, even if you do have that.
Absolutely.
No different than what you have achieved. I mean, you've got 17 world titles that didn't come by chance.
No.
I mean, we're talking dedication to the ultimate degree, and you can see in this room here that they've done the same, which is, discipline at its finest.
So let's talk about kind of a little bit of that dynamic of like free range, finding big whitetails in the wilds, as opposed to, a place that's managed.
The opportunity for me, Ralph Incholero, Archer's Choice, told me something probably, I'm going to shoot at the hip here and go, it's got to be pushing, call it 18, 20 years ago. I had the pleasure of meeting with him and I bought him lunch at a trade show one time. And the last statement he said is what changed my direction, which is he said, if you can't find it on your property, you have to create it or go somewhere else. And at that point in time, I realized that bow hunting was my primary, and it shouldn't have been. It should have been basically a land steward first. And when I switched that around and started taking care of the land and making it better for the whitetails to give them the opportunity to age and build that age structure, that's when my whole mindset changed. I was more focused on wind direction and food plots and basically the stand locations, right? That's just scratching the surface. And when we flipped it and started doing warm season grasses and timber stand improvements and edge feathering and having food 365 days a year, so that we built a plan around every single farm that allowed us to focus and allow the deer to give them no reason to leave, right? That was the assessment that I learned. And since I flipped that is when success has changed.
Well, let's rewind quite a bit from that and talk about maybe what led you to that moment, that chance encounter, kind of the grassroots beginning of this. What brought archery into your life? What brought the outdoors into your life?
Uncle Jerry, who is my dad's brother, it's going to be tough because he passed away. And he was probably my mentor, without doubt. And he had 3 sons, Jeff, Jim, and John, and without them, I probably wouldn't be here. Those guys took me in at a very, very young age, and kind of showed me the outdoor space, and which was pheasant, quail. Come fall opening season, they had German short hairs, and we would travel to Spalding, Nebraska, to Greater Omaha and suburbs of Omaha, and hunt as much as we possibly could. And without those guys bringing me in, I know I wouldn't be exposed to the outdoors.
Such a relatable experience.
Yeah.
And that's the heritage of what we do, is that pass on from one generation to the next. It's
So
just-
true. Yeah. And then went on to college and chased a lot of waterfowl with some college buddies, and then met my girlfriend, ended up being my favorite doe. And she introduced me to her brother in northern Minnesota, John, and he was shooting a Fred Bear bow at the time. And this has got to be, man, 27 years ago, probably. And he's about my structure. He said, hey, you want to go shoot this thing? He was sighting it in for season. I had no idea about a bow. I mean, nothing, zero. And drew it back and shot it. And my girlfriend, now wife, looked at me and she goes, God's sake, you don't need another hobby.
So the little backyard archery.
That was
your
it.
first exposure.
He was sighting in his bow.
Set
That was
the
it.
hook.
That was it. And that next following week, I came home and just went off the deep end.
Yeah.
Went to a local archery store in Marshall, Wisconsin, called Little John's Archery, and been going there ever since for the last 25, 27 years.
Yeah.
And I just started going to seminars, reading books. Anybody who I could find that had something to say, I was front row and center.
Just kind of collecting knowledge, from all these sources, and
Just building the craft,
Yeah.
right? Take a little bit here, take a little bit there, and some of the stuff I would agree or disagree, but you start listening to multi people that have been there and done that, and before you know it, you kind of create your own mold and your own approach, and it's amazing what it'll do when you have people who you can, like yourself, mentor people.
And I'm sure during that time of trying to, figure everything out, kind of build this whole ball of wax, there's high points and low points, probably some setbacks at times, as far as, shooting process and, what works best and, how, what's my maximum range, can I hit, this at 20, 30, 40,
It boils down to, obviously technique, but also your equipment. And I was very naive early on because all of our stuff was, geared towards 15 to, low 30s, yardage wise.
Yeah, for distance, relatively close yardage.
Yeah, right.
And
And
a lot of the whitetail woods, 30 yards is a long shot.
Pretty
For example,
much.
where I live, I mean,
but as bows have gotten better and so forth, and you get better at your craft, technologies move the needle substantially compared to what was 27 years ago. And now, now we're throwing IBO speeds of low 340s to you want to talk about some of these bows are 355, 360.
330 is a really common number. Just
It's
to
a common
pick a low
number.
ball, good common
It wasn't
average
that
number.
way 27 years ago.
Yeah, 300 used to be a big number. I remember
Yes, it was. When we broke 300, that was a big deal.
that. Yeah, it was like a barrier.
It was. So with that, it's changed my whole mental setup for whitetail hunting now, from with the PSE opportunities of how fast they shoot, and
What was your first fast bow?
the X-Force,
PSE X-Force.
hands down. That was like, I thought there's nothing better.
That just like flipped a switch for you. You're
It
like,
completely changed my approach to the whitetail setup. That was the first time ever that the speed of a bow allowed me to reassess my arrow weight and alignment of what I was going to throw down range. Because it was so fast, I'm like, okay, now we're at the point where I can go, instead of having a pin at 15, 20, and 25 or 30, or 20 and 30, depending on the situation, I'm like, I sat down and just grabbed a pad and pen and just started doing math. And I'm like, if I get my arrow weight plus or minus, I think it was 405, 410, I can go 0 to 30 with one pen. I never had that opportunity before. And the reason why that's such a big deal is in the whitetail space, the less you move in a set, the more opportunity they have, obviously, to harvest.
Right.
The more you move, and so that takes away that rangefinder move. And if I knew that I could go 0 to 30, anything inside of 30, which how often you're going to have something, 30 yards and in outside of the timber? Never. It's always inside of 30 just because of brush. And so when I figured that out, it changed everything. It changed my kill rate, success rate, because the arrow was getting there quicker. I didn't have to think. I didn't have to mentally process. And so when you start eliminating those things, it changes more of the process and allow you to just focus on the shot instead of range finding how close, what he is. All that's now neutralized. And now you just draw and go. And when I flipped that switch is when my success changed.
So to me, it sounds like there are three real pinnacle moments in like the essence, the beginning of your outdoor career, the introduction of it through family,
Yep.
camaraderie with
100%.
uncles and cousins and stuff like that. And then, the pinnacle moment of discovering archery. And then that pinnacle moment of, having a conversation with an industry icon about how to properly manage what you were doing, changing your process, your approach.
100%. And I think that's the part that, at this new age of podcasts that we're doing now, when I started, we had to go to seminars. We didn't have this.
Or magazines. Bow hunting magazines were a thing.
Well, yeah, exactly. And that's where you got your knowledge from. And now we're doing this, which is, sharing what we all know and the mistakes and successes to help somebody else behind us. And I think that's both of our responsibilities, is to share that, to elevate the game of archery.
Now, if we can, I kind of want to get into a little bit of like how this obsession for these massive bucks kind of ascended, kind of the upward trajectory of it. Because, your first archery bow hunting experience, you obviously weren't out there, I don't think anyway, trying to target a 200-inch whitetail.
No, absolutely not.
So tell me a little bit about that journey of, as like your first encounters with decent bucks and how it led to better bucks, and what was it that made that fire burn within you to ascend to where it is now?
I think it's the process, right? Which is, the more work you put in and you see the rewards of that, you're like, where can this go, right? And the more work we put in, I'm like, where is the end of this? And it just kept getting better and better and better. And the more I did, the more we received. And I'm like, I know there's more here. And so when you start shooting, 130s and 140s, and you're like, okay, how do we get to 150s and 160s? Well, you got to let the 130s and 140s go to get the 150s and 160s. Well, then you shoot a few of those, and you're like, okay, now how do we get to, that 170? It's kind of like the pinnacle mark.
Yeah.
And then you're like, well, now we got to let the 160s walk. Well, that's a hard thing to do. It becomes a mental game. It's not a physical game at that point now, because you got to trust the process and bet on the whitetail that hopefully when you let them go, that Mother Nature's not going to take them in some way.
Or your neighbor.
Or the neighbor.
Yeah.
But if you build the farms properly and you bank on giving them the proper food, cover, and water.
Not giving them a reason to leave.
Then hopefully those cards fall. And you're not going to win them all, but you try to win the majority of them. And then, you knock down a 170, and you're like, okay, we've done that. Now let's keep going to the next one.
It's for the average guy, almost fighting that internal greed. It's like, oh my gosh, that's a really decent buck. And that's the biggest buck I've ever seen. It's 130. I was stuttering even thinking about, like, how do I let that deer walk away? But it's trust in that process.
It's the process, and it becomes more mental than physical. And that's the hardest part that the average, and I'm throwing myself in this bucket, Joe Bowhunter has to really focus on. And yeah, it's borderline a foolish move. But after you get X number of 140s or 130s, I'm just a driven guy. I want to go to the next step. What can we do? And before you know it, you put the time and energy in, and you hit your first 200-inch deer, and now you're like, okay, now I know this, I get it. My first 200-inch deer is what taught me and elevated my game. It was a 4-year quest, and it took me 4 years to figure them out.
Substantial level of dedication.
Yes.
It's borders on the obsession of really putting the goal and the process on the balance beam, and you want the goal, but you have to focus on each rung of the ladder or you'll never get there.
You do. And 4 years was a long time.
Oh, I bet.
And I thought this was never going to happen.
That deer haunted your nightmares?
It was horrible. My wife thought I was in insanity, But that day it all came together. I mean, it's if someone want to go see it, it's on YouTube now. I think it's pushing 1 million views.
I bet your wife was relieved when it was over.
Yeah, she was my first phone call, and she's like, I think she said thank God or something like that.
I've got him back.
Yeah, right.
Dad's coming home.
Right, exactly. But that one whitetail taught me so much, because I had to learn how to harvest them, because he was so smart and so difficult that he set me up to harvest 2 more.
So you've seen repeatable patterns in that deer's behavior that you hadn't seen in potentially other deer's behavior that have helped you make a better approach at even more mature deer?
Yes and no, which is it forced me to dissect the information we were getting, which was not what I was focused on. So when you look at trail cameras, when is he coming and going? What direction is he coming from? We found his sheds at, we call it the Pretty Woods, not once, but twice in the spring within 60 yards of each other. That's when I started putting all the dots together.
That's a huge breadcrumb right there.
Right, of all the information to go, okay, we're putting a set here, we're gonna be here somewhere around, early November, and wait for the right pressure, the right wind, and we're gonna go in there, we're gonna sit all day. So that was on November, I think it was November the 4th or November the 5th, 2017. And when I saw him for the first time, it was the first time I've ever seen a 200-inch whitetail on the hoof in the wild.
Free range. Yeah.
Free range. And mentally, my mind was purely mashed potatoes. It could not process. He dominated my mind space. The first shot window came, nothing. I was just in awe. He just dominated me. And the camera's guy, Greg, are you here? Are you here? And I wasn't.
Yeah.
And then second one came, and then the vitals were covered up, and 4 days later, we ended up getting him. But I literally, when it happened, the quest was so long, there was so much emotion mentally behind it, I almost fell out of the tree.
Yeah.
Because the adrenaline was so bad, I physically had to hang on to the tree because I was going to fall out.
That's a very interesting point you make there, the adrenaline, the arousal.
Right.
That's what I call it in the competitive archery space. Some people will attach, nerves or pressure. They'll attach a negative association with it. And for me, I look at that adrenaline as arousal. And when I'm in moments like that, I think back to other points in my life that might not have even been on the field of play, where I've had that feeling and had something good happen. It's almost like a bit of a mind trick now, so that when that feeling occurs, you project back to a place where I've had success, and you're like, when I get this feeling, good things happen. So you start looking at the glass, for me, half full, how do I fill the rest of it? Not half full, holy shit, it's got a hole in it, So it's learning how to kind of trick the mind, and it works in the competitive space, and I believe it would also work in the hunting space as well.
100%, because now you've been there and done that. So now your mental space, as you know, is more important than the physical, process.
100%.
And once you got there, then you're like, okay, we can do this again.
Yeah.
And I was fortunate enough on the second one to be a 239-inch whitetail, which is the largest whitetail ever harvested in outdoor television history. And mentally, I was numb in the whole process because I had to block everything out because he had me at hello when he came out of the field.
Well, in that instance there, the parallel I draw is, in that instance, the second time around, you chose to act and not react. The first time with exposure to a deer that big, you were reacting. He was running the show. He was acting. You were forced to react to his actions and the presence that he put upon you. Come the second time around, now you're acting. You're in control.
It was completely different. Yeah, the control was completely different. When I saw him, I was like, this game is over. You're all mine now.
Yeah.
But the first time it happened, it was really tough for me to keep it together.
Yeah.
It's our parallels were coming from two different spectrums, right? From your side of target to our side in the whitetail space. But when you boil it down, the emotions and the process, they're very similar.
Yes, they are.
Because you got to execute in the moment of truth, and you only get one arrow to do it. If that doesn't work out, it doesn't work out.
And we're also trying to miss by less. We're putting things in place long before we ever get into that tree stand, so that when we are faced with that arousal and things do erode and you're reacting, not acting, you're not in control, so that when you make a mistake, it misses by a little bit less, thus resulting in a clean, ethical harvest, not a lost animal, not a long recovery, etc., things like that. So it's we try to make this divide, within our crowd. You have archers and bow hunters, target archers and bow hunters. Honestly, in this, we're all archers. And if more people that take to the field to harvest game would spend some time maybe going to a local tournament and trying to cultivate that feeling, that adrenaline, because it's like, maybe if you're just a regular bow hunter and you walk out to a 3D shoot, a local shoot, say there's only 30 people. Like, man, there's 30 people standing around and try to shoot this target at, 35 yards. It shouldn't be an issue for you because you've done it all your whole life in your backyard, but now there's, 30 sets of eyeballs on you. Probably going to make some mistakes, but you're also going to learn something very valuable that you could take into the woods and ethically harvest that next, giant whitetail or, pesky doe that's getting into the garden or whatever.
It's a valid point, because the more time you put yourself into those pressure situations and you achieve and you come out on top, mentally, now you've won. And then you can always reflect to that when that moment of truth comes back. I've been there and done that, let's just do it again.
Yeah, I've always thought if you can go out and execute at the level you practice at, you'll be unbeatable.
Preparation, there's no substitution for it, though.
Success occurs when preparation meets opportunity.
That's right. Yeah. No doubt.
So, given what we talked about, the process and the preparation for that moment, and maybe immersing yourself in raw new experiences to maybe introduce you to that adrenaline, that arousal before you get a field, let's talk a little bit about, say, like the night before, or maybe even the moments before. You're in your stand, in your blind, the golden hour is approaching. Is there a process where you visualize, you think about a potential shot presentation for this location, that location? How's that? Do you utilize that time before the golden hour to kind of see any of that?
The minute or I guess the last hour, whatever it may be, I'm constantly looking out at where the opportunities are going to come, and I'm constantly doing a mental check. That's 15, that's 18, that's 31, and just constantly repeating it. He's going to come from here. What's going to happen? He's going to be moving to my left. I'm going to have to let him get by me before I make the shot, because he's going to be quartering two. So I got to let him get by me to do that. So that process is constantly playing back in my head over and over and over and over. Because when it does happen, you don't have time to process that. And if you don't sit and be prepared and go through that process before, it's probably not going to end well to your favor.
Yeah, in target archery, we have a very similar thing, the pre-shot routine. But even before the pre-shot routine comes, it's the projection. Projection for me is building a mind space that's familiar with the venue before I ever get there. You have the luxury of, you've gone out and set your stand or your blind up. You know where your shooting lanes are, you know where your wind direction is from, you know where your sunrise and sunset are, you know where your shadow is going to be cast, you know if you're going to be skylined or not. You have that luxury of having been in there. So it's like you can close your eyes, project yourself, and like, well, if this does this, I do this. And if that does that, then I do this. So you have the ability to kind of role play a whole theater of scenarios in your mind before you go out there. And we do very much the same thing in target archery. I have gone to test events for world championships hosted by the countries that are hosting the world championships. So I have a test event like a year out. And they might not use the exact same venue and terrain, but they'll use something in the area. And it's more just a dry run for like the tournament organizers and stuff, and transportation, and can we successfully run an event? And I've gone to these events to build that mental compodium so that the entire year between events I can project myself there and do very much the same thing you're talking about, play those scenarios in my head. And I think that's something that would benefit every bow hunter, because I mean, you've got so much time sitting there in the tree, right?
It is.
Use it appropriately to give yourself an advantage so that you're acting and not reacting in a scenario.
And I think there is a baseball coach who told me something a long time ago, which is if you practice enough in the correct form, your muscle memory will take over when your mind doesn't. And I think for you and for I, in those moments of truth, that is so true, because if you put the time in behind the stick and string, sometimes mentally you're not there. And mentally you're not drawing back, but if you do it enough, it just becomes secondary. And that's one thing I've learned in this whole process as well, is separation is in the preparation. And without it, that moment of truth when your mind is really frazzled, you got to fall back on muscle memory and execute. Because you think you know what a 200-inch deer is, you think you know what a 180 class deer is, but until he's at 20 or 30 yards, he's a hell of a lot bigger than you ever think he is. And he just dominates your all being.
So walking with like that heavy head bob.
Oh, it's just
like
insane.
Yeah.
You know, and so you fall back to practice. Yeah. And if you do it enough, it becomes second nature. Now you just got to focus and execute.
And I think like another thing in my world you look at is when you ascend to that level of muscle memory. You know, the subconscious is truly engaged. And then the conscious mind is only there just to drop little breadcrumbs and kind of keep you on track. And something that has really helped me over the years is, especially in the later part of my career, is to be aware of trying to make little enhancements along the way as I'm going through the process. Because, you know, they say, stupidity is, I guess, trying to do the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. Well, sometimes in professional archery, your shot routine can get in a rut and you have minimal time, if any, to self-diagnose, make changes, and stay in the tent ring. You know, so not being afraid to make subtle changes to that routine on a conscious level to keep your conscious mind entertained. It's like, here, conscious mind, play with this, so the subconscious mind can do what it's done a million times.
I mean, when you look at your accomplishments, right, it tells me one thing, which is you've never settled, which is you're always looking to improve that process. There's always something more to go get.
Yeah, it's the love of the chase,
right?
Not the goals. Yeah.
It's the process.
Yeah.
You embrace the process, and that's the same thing that we have. We're always constantly tweaking sets, always making food plots better, making the land better. You know, everything we have, we're trying to make better. If you never look at making a change, then accept what's already here. Well, if you accept, then you're accepting what you've got.
Yeah, you're right there. You're where you wanted to be.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, you and I think, come out of the same mold. We're not willing to accept that.
Yeah.
And we always want to push that envelope.
A lot of times, like, it's so hard, though, not to look at that shiny up, the goal, you know, that monster whitetail or gold medal. It's what we all want.
Right.
But it really takes a special breed to break it down backwards. It's like, okay, you know, here's a trophy class buck. How do I get there? You know, and you work your way backwards. It's a gold medal. How do I get there? You work your way backwards. And it all comes down to just literally one little tiny breadcrumb after the other before you get there. And it's just super important for people to kind of, you know, keep track of that. Remember that. It's the little tiny things that matter.
I would love to hear your thoughts, but I think your success is basically making micro adjustments. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
But after you make several of them, all those they become a lot. But you're not afraid to make change.
Right.
And most people are afraid to make change, and that's where the line is hardly ever crossed. You got to not be afraid to make a change.
Not be afraid to let that 130 walk.
Right, because you can always go back. Right.
Yeah, you can always shoot him next week.
That's right.
If you need to.
If you need to.
Yeah.
Exactly right. But most people just can't get there, and it's really that simple. That's one thing I learned a long time ago, is someone says, it's not that simple. I disagree. It is that simple.
Yeah. It's a conscious decision. You choose to succeed or you choose to fail.
It's a choice.
Choosing to succeed will be choosing to be different, act different, put a plan together, and have a process. Choosing to fail will be choosing to do the same thing over and over again.
What is your choice? What path you want to go? So
it really seems to me, and I know from my experience, and I'm getting the same kind of vibe from you, that the process is really, that's almost the passion, the addiction. You know, we all started off wanting the goal. That was the addiction. That's what drove us. But then, like, as we matured in what we do, it almost rewinds back a little bit. Like, yeah, the gold medal or the huge whitetail, you know, that's what everybody else is going to see. But I think the true reward really comes in the execution of that process, even through its high points and low points.
You have to embrace it. And if you don't, and fall in love with it.
Yeah.
Right? Because if it becomes work, then you're not gonna want to get better. And I love the process. I love the land management side. I mean, what you've taught me in the last 72 hours is, I would have never got to where I am, just in little tweaks that you've shown me behind the bow in the last few days. Mentally, I'm like, I would have never even thought of it. but you got to be open to learn, and you can't put your, I guess, ego and be humble enough to put it in your back pocket and never be good enough to not learn. And I think that's some of the issue that some of us all have, is embrace that process, but never stop learning.
And I tell some people, and this catches them off guard, but that's kind of my style. I tell them, I love the misery about it. They're like, why would you love something miserable? I'm like, you're not understanding me. It's the challenge every day of it.
Right.
Like getting up and going, like, yeah, you know, you could go sit at a desk somewhere from 8 to 5. And that's not really very challenging. But the misery of it, like, I got to go out there and I got to shoot 300 arrows today. And I really don't want to, because I shot 300 arrows yesterday. You know, same as you. It's like, oh, you know, we got to go out there and we got to feather this tree line, or we got to cut, you know, windfalls, or we got to go out there and look at the land. You know, embracing the misery of it. Yeah.
That's what separates. And when you embrace that, that's when the goal becomes obtainable. And the closer you get to it, the more it becomes reality. And then once you hit it, you're like, now it's repeatable. Now I get it. Once you get it once, you've cracked the code. But it takes a long time to get there. Discipline and time is what it all boils down to, staying disciplined. We can all do it. It's just who wants to be the disciplined to achieve it.
Yeah, who wants to enjoy the journey?
That's it. Yeah. It's really that simple. It's not difficult, but that's the separation.
So let's do just like a quick little dive into equipment setup and selection, because the bows that I choose for what I do, and even what I hunt with, sounds to me very vastly from what really gets you going, what you really like. So axle to axle, poundage, arrow setup, give me a rundown on your gear.
When I got introduced to the carbon from PSE, I have never looked back. I just think there's so many benefits from it. You know, we hunt a lot of cold weather stuff.
Yeah. Grip on the riser.
The grip on the riser is huge when you're holding that thing for 3, 4, 5 minutes at, you know, 9 degrees or minus 10 degrees.
Not to mention from a technical aspect, the expansion and contraction of aluminum versus temperature swings. Yeah.
Right? The consistency, which you have taught me a lot here in the last few days about being consistent. And that's all part of it. And the more you believe in your gear that you're holding, the mental process becomes more dialed in.
So about that gear, what kind of poundage do you like to whitetail hunt with?
I love 70-72.
70-72, yeah.
Yep. I love the carbon bows preferred. I like 30 to 32.5, maybe 33 axle to axle.
What kind of let off?
You know, it all varies based on what I'm trying to, you know, when I go out west, whitetail I may have a little bit more let off, because sometimes I'm holding back for a minute.
For a given scenario until a presentation is made by the animal.
I may hold up, maybe I might hold for a minute and a half. You know, but when I go out west, I'm not going to hold for a minute and a half, you know? So it all depends on what game I'm chasing. Same with the arrow setup, right? So if I'm going west, I'm going to be plus or minus that 500 to 530 grain arrow. When I go to the whitetail setup, I'm going to be pushing a 405 to 410 arrow total weight.
You shoot the same broadhead for both of those scenarios? Or you have like a favorite broadhead setup, like if you're going to go out west, a lot bigger animals, heavier arrow versus, you know, back east?
Whitetails, I'm a true fan of the expandables. They're thin skin animals, more hemorrhaging, obviously, the quicker the harvest. When you go out west for elk, it's obviously much more hair, thicker hide. I really prefer a fixed. I think I'm not saying expandables won't work. I think it comes back to the mental game, right? You got to believe in your gear.
Shot placement and animal presentation. There's just some presentations with a certain kind of broadhead, you're maybe going to wait and get, you know, have a better opportunity.
100%.
Yeah.
So it just seems to have proven itself. And now with the rec broadheads that I'm using now, regardless of which one they use, they fly so well that my confidence is through the roof.
Now I noticed something while we were shooting here the other day, the fletchings in particular on your arrows. Vastly different than everything everybody else had in camp. You know, we're all shooting very conventional, you know, a 2-inch, maybe a slightly higher profile, some like a 3-inch, maybe a little longer profile, etc. You had something really unique on the back end of your arrows. Is that specifically for a whitetail type setup like you're using here?
It's purely, they're called Zinger fletchers. And the reason I've switched is because when we go to Alaska and out west, when we're going through brush and so forth, constantly on the spot and stock, stuff grabbing at you and pulling at you all the time. And over the years, I've lost veins.
Sure.
And when you lose a vein, that arrow is dead, is basically dead to you. And when you're in the middle of Alaska, that's a problem.
Oh yeah, big time.
You know, you don't have...
You didn't bring all the materials and supplies, you got weight restrictions, yeah.
all that stuff, right? And so when I found this product, I'm like, it flies just as good, it's just as quiet, and it's as durable as a tank. And so it checked all the boxes for me. And it's simple, it's easy, and one more thing off the list of potential failure. And when you're on a mountain in the backcountry, failures you're trying to eliminate as much as you can.
Right, right. So let's talk about arrow speed a little bit, you know, because you said you're shooting, you know, fairly light arrow, which I don't know if I would consider, you know, around that 400 grains fairly light, because I mean, myself, I shoot a very conventional arrow setup. You know, I hunt with, you know, 60 pounds most of the time, usually not much more than that. You know, I go by the spine chart, I'm in about a 350 spine, I've got a 100 grain point. My arrows probably weigh about 450. So to me, and I look at my target arrows, they're like 400 to 420, depending on what they are. So when you say a 400 grain arrow, I don't think that's light. But popular myths and opinions abound today, and different theories and philosophies. Some people might be shocked that you're shooting a 400 grain arrow. What kind of arrow speed are you getting out of your current PSE bow? What model is it with that setup?
The model I'm currently shooting is the Levitate, but now after shooting the Mach 30, I'm trying to pull some strings here.
Trying to pull some strings and get one?
Yeah, trying to get one here in the next few weeks.
We're about the same draw length, so if you find that guy.
So, but I actually work my arrow weight backwards is what I do. I focus on 310 for feet per second.
That's your number.
That's my number.
Threshold you want.
Maybe 308 or 309 or 311, but I'm shooting for 310. And then I build my arrow weight to that.
And you figured that 310 is based off experience you've had in the woods with certain scenarios?
It's all based around the whitetails. We talk about elk, that's a whole other conversation.
Sure,
but for whitetails, I want to be around that 310. Why? Because of speed. Because when you're chasing whitetail, now the whitetails, you know, the bows are so good today, they're not jumping the string, they're jumping the arrow.
Sure.
The sound of the arrow.
Yeah.
And I've done the testing. I watched, you know, hundreds of hours of footage of deer in a food plot. And I can 100% tell you with confidence that the arrow going at the animal is the one that will drop first.
The sound of certain broadheads, the sound of certain fletching combinations.
All of it.
Yeah.
It's not the bow that's triggering that, because if you do it in slow motion, you'll see the animal that you're shooting is dropping first, and the rest of them around it are actually domino effect from that reaction. So they're a quarter second or half a second delayed.
I mean, the speed of sound 750 miles an hour.
Right.
You know, so
but it's interesting.
The sound of the bow going off is in one stationary location, but as the arrow travels forward,
it's at one.
That speed of sound is 750 miles an hour it's moving with the arrow. So it's obviously the sound of the arrow's got to be getting there before the sound of the bow.
Right. So it's interesting that one that you're shooting is the one that's dropping, and the rest are domino around. So that tells me it's not the bow.
Right.
It tells me it's the flight of the arrow. And so when I figured that out, I'm like, okay, I got to get that arrow as fast as there as I can.
Yeah.
And so it kind of between slug weight, kinetic energy, everything, I'm like, you know what? I kind of have the best of both worlds, pulling 71, 72 pounds with 310 speed, and it's going to fall around 405 to 410 weight.
Okay.
And that's just kind of the magic number. And since we've come to that, our success rate's gone through the roof, because we're getting it quicker to that animal before it has a chance to drop. And if it drops, it's not dropping it as much. Because when you think about a whitetail window, you're looking at, call it a pie plate, right? 8 to 10 inches, right? So if you put it dead middle and you're shooting let's call it a most common speed is probably going to be a 275 to 280.
Yeah. You've given up half of your kill zone.
That's right.
To begin with. Yeah.
Exactly, because of the drop.
Yeah. Now, with that kind of speed and the evolution that bows have made since your first fast bow, your first speed bow, the X-Force, how much more forgiving and accurate have the bows gotten at that speed, and how much easier is it to attain that speed versus maybe 5 years ago?
It's the equipment we have today. The average guy is way better of an archer than I was 25, 26 years ago.
I see that on my side. 15-year-old kids shooting world records. Yeah.
You know, and so they're way more enjoyable. They're dead in the hand. The let off is great. It's just more enjoyable of an experience to shoot.
It's a better user experience.
100%.
Yeah. Greg, I want to thank you a bunch for taking the time to join me on PSC Archery's Behind the Peep podcast. This has been a really great conversation. I've learned a ton. It's been really great candor and good back and forth. I'd love to have you on the podcast again later on, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about target archery. Definitely get into some bow hunting. Heck, maybe even take you to an archery tournament at some point in time.
I need to do that. After hanging out with you guys, this is a box that's now on the list that I need to check because it's truly fascinating. It's a whole nother element that I don't understand. You know, I just never put the time and energy because we're so focused on one element. It's so time consuming that I don't have time for this. But now I'm going to have to try to find a date that I can make that happen.
Chisel out some time. We'll bring you to a big archery tournament. I'm sure you're going to make the shoot down. Probably going to win. So.
I don't know, staying on the line with you guys and your experience, that is just pure, that is a mental game that's going to be tough to even overcome.
Well,
looking left and looking right, that's tough.
It sounds like you've got the experience and the chops for it, and you're committed to the process and enjoying being in the moment. I think you're going to fit right in.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's been an absolute joy.
Absolute pleasure. So in closing, I want to say thank you very much for joining me and Greg here on PSC Archery's Behind the Peep podcast. Stay tuned for future episodes and more guests.